Stay in school. By EXOLIEF. I don't think now is the time for something like this. What? Are you busy or something? Cheerilee looked over to the stallion standing in the doorway to her classroom. Being naked was something all ponies were used to, but in Soarin's case, it felt odd to be out of his Wonderbolt suit every now and again. What was even odder, however, was the fact that standing on his hind legs in this position, with his forelegs on the doorway, he looked very strange to the casual and composed teacher. Soarin had come to check in on the grades of Rumble, the little brother of a friend of his, seeing as how he couldn't make it to a parent-teacher conference this week. Thunderlane was known for being late and getting out of his work, but that became impossible during the busy season. Being the kind-hearted friend that he is, Soarin offered to go in his place so that he could report back to Thunderlane on just how well Rumble was doing in class. The pink-maned teacher found it hard not to stare at the physique of the famous Wonderbolt. Of all places to be, he graced her classroom in the middle of the night, with his stunning abdomen and throbbing muscles. Composing herself enough to answer his question, she replied, "You're just a little late, that's all. I was about to pack up my things and head home." In truth, he was more than a little late. It was 9 p.m., and Cheerilee had quite a few papers to grade that she preferred to get done in the comfort of her own home, rather than in this now fairly hot, considering the impressive stallion before her, room. Soarin landed on his 4 hooves and trotted over to Cheerilee quickly. Naturally, he expressed his disappointment in not being able to arrive sooner in the most eloquent of ways. What? Really? Oh, man, I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do to change your mind? Placing his hoof on her shoulder, Soarin tried to reason with the attractive, for her age, teacher, but only ended up sending a tingle along her back as she felt his rather manly touch. Noticing this, he rubbed her shoulder a bit to see if he could get a more honest reaction out of her. Needless to say, she delivered in spades. A soft moan could be heard escaping her lips while Soarin began to relieve the tension in her right shoulder. She hadn't felt the touch of another pony in a long time. She was afraid that no pony would ever bother touching her once she became a teacher, and for a while she was right. Tonight, however, was different. Cheerilee could barely even stand as his hoof drew lower, down her back until it reached her petite flank and rubbed the spot where her smiling cutie mark rested. Her fur almost stood on end as she tried to eke out any attempt to lie and get out of this before she knew what was going to happen. "Not there. Don't. Oh." Soarin smirked triumphantly as his hoof prodded the slick wetness between her flanks. He hadn't come here with the intention of fooling around with his friend's brother's teacher, but once he saw her face and that cute body of hers, he knew he couldn't resist. Releasing more moans than before, Cheerilee looked over to the Wonderbolt standing over her, as she attempted to hold her weak legs up by resting her forelegs on the desk. She could see the smile on his face, and she knew that he had her, but she couldn't care less at this point. The teacher's lithe body was speaking to both of them with the way it squirmed under his touch. All signs pointed to going right on ahead and bucking each other like mad ponies, but Soarin wasn't insecure enough to make any bad decisions. Cheerilee continued to moan as the stallion above her nibbled her ear gently before whispering into it with a husky voice. "What do you want?" "What I want?" Cheerilee's words were sparse between her belabored pants. She knew what she was going to get if she said what she was going to say next, but she wanted it oh so badly. Between her legs, an unquenchable fire was building that she would never be able to satisfy by herself. Just for one night, she could indulge herself willingly if this was the situation she found herself in. "I want you inside." Soarin, while always willing to oblige a lady, wasn't exactly in peak condition at the moment. After hearing her response, he chuckled heartily and removed his hoof, allowing her to look around as if to wonder why he stopped. Turning slightly and hopping up on the desk in front of her, however, he revealed exactly what the problem was. "Well, you see, there's a little something I could use your help with, Miss Cheerilee." Her eyes widened as soon as she saw it. Even without being fully erect, Soarin's stallionhood was nothing to scoff at, standing at a proud height and arcing only slightly downwards, as if to face her. Giggling seductively, Cheerilee's hoof reached for the hood in front of her and stroked gently as she spoke. I'd say that's a big problem you've got there. Have you been thinking about me in class again, young man?" Soarin wasn't particularly amused by her teacher-based musings, seeing as he was probably the same age if not older than her, but decided to play along anyway. Her stroking was the only thing he could focus on at the moment, so he wouldn't mind if he just had to eke out a few words every now and again beside his occasional grunts. "Uh-huh." Cheerilee couldn't help but laugh goofily in response. She had a thing for playing up her teacher persona in her fantasies, but unfortunately she never got a chance to use it until now. The teasing comments she made only served to make her stroke with more effort as well as give a loving lick to the tip of Soarin's rising member. It slid out of its sheath after only a few moments of this, giving the impression that Cheerilee clearly had been doing things right. Even after years out of practice, she still knew how to please a stallion, and knowing that only turned her on more so. Looking up at him slyly, she held her lust-filled gaze while she slowly moved her lips over his flared tip. Naturally, this set off Soarin more than he could have imagined as she took it into her warm mouth and immediately began to lap at the shaft in earnest. A groan of sensation flew out of his mouth as he threw his head back, enjoying the attention this magenta pony gave him. Catching his reaction in the corner of her eyes, she smiled and began to suck eagerly, only imagining his length inside her as she did so. Judging by the size and the way it slid deep into her throat, she believed she could take his length and enjoy it immensely if he was prepared enough. Her performance indicated that he would be ready in less than a minute, if that. In fact, Soarin noticed just how well Cheerilee was sucking him off before she did, feeling her saliva coat him as well as her slippery tongue reaching all the places he didn't bother with himself, proved to be too much for him. Tapping the desk with his hoof was his way of saying, "I give." Soarin let her know that he wouldn't be able to take much more of this if she continued without a break. Smiling again, she slid off of him with a popping sound as her lips broke away from the tip hesitantly. Continuing to stroke his entire length slowly, however, she asked in a mocking tone, "Oh, what's wrong? Is the naughty student afraid of coming in my mouth?" Soarin refrained from groaning at her words and instead chose to be more direct. "Just turn around." Cheerilee wanted to pout, but seemed far too pleased with his answer and obediently did as she was told. Facing the chalkboard with her rump in the air, she presented herself to Soarin as openly as she could, even going so far as to reach back and spread her cheeks apart. She taunted him one final time to get him to make his move. "Ready for your extra credit assignment?" Quickly hopping off the desk and lining up his tip with her moist entrance, he figured the best way to answer was just to give her what she wanted. He sure gave it to her all right. "Ugh." A surprised gasp burst forth from Cheerilee's lips as she felt Soarin shove himself inside her, rougher than she expected. She had no idea that Soarin wasn't quite in the same teasing mood as she was, but that was apparent from the first strong penetration. There was no chance of her complaining, however, as his thick stallionhood completely filled her to the brim. After only a few seconds, in fact, she could feel him reach her innermost depths and brush against her womb. Needless to say, it was quite the amazing sensation for her, as was evidenced by her shaking legs and dopey expression. Soarin wasn't exempt from the pleasure either, as he slowly slid his way out and felt her tight hole suck him with more effort than her mouth had, surprisingly. It felt as if her body was set on not relinquishing him until he stayed inside long enough to buck her hard, which was exactly what he was going to do. With no intention of pulling all the way out, he brought his tip back until it rubbed against her sweet lips, before plunging it back in and making an obscene noise in the process. The inner walls teased and massaged the sensitive rod that began to pump in and out of them, and Soarin was quickly falling prey to the surprisingly impressive skill that cheerilee had. Of all ponies to be talented at working their muscles like this, he wouldn't have expected an earth pony, much less a teacher. Soarin couldn't help but think back to the few lucky Pegasi fangirls that he had managed to have sex with in the past, and remembered that he had never been with an earth pony before. Were they all this talented with their bodies? Her performance was the furthest thing from cheerilee's mind, instead finding herself only slightly wishing that she could bury his cock just a little deeper each time. Thankfully, she found a rhythm with him that involved her small waist pressing back into Soarin and devouring his meat with each thrust. Her thoughts became glazed over with pleasure. She found herself reduced to simple moans and yells of satisfaction as he pounded her. Her tongue lazily hung out of her mouth. She attempted to speak in her clearly dazed voice. "That's it. Yes." Soarin only groaned out in response, feeling his climax drawing near as he worked himself inside her faster and faster. His wings began to flutter out of his control. His hips were moving on their own, and he could feel cheerilee squeeze down on him tighter than ever before. In these few moments of belated breath, no sounds could be heard throughout the room except for the teacher's loud screams of delight. Her juices flowed freely out of her while Soarin just kept on thrusting, clearly having experienced enough to endure through his partner's climax. Deciding that he had had enough, Soarin made a final push into her hot depths and released himself inside the disheveled mare. The sudden force of the orgasm startled cheerilee, and ended up with her face pressed against the chalkboard as she took in the entirety of his load. In this state of extreme sensation, she could barely do anything besides sit there and enjoy the feeling of hot cum seep out of her, along with her own evidence already forming a puddle on the ground. Soarin's face gazed at her in sheer bliss, his own thoughts being quickly forgotten as he came down from his high. His wings stuck out like sore thumbs as he slowly slid himself out of the beautiful mare, and allowed them both time to slump down in their places, a few feet away from each other. Finding the sight of the weakened cheerilee an attractive sight, Soarin allowed his wings to carry him over to her, and leaned down to wrap his foreleg over her shoulder once again. She looked back up at him, barely able to form any words through her attempts to catch her breath. Clearly that was quite the workout for cheerilee, considering that a famous athlete had just bucked her after years of little to no sexual stimulation. Soarin attempted to comfort her as he helped her stand up and spoke. "Are you all right?" Yes, I'll be just fine." Seeing her regain her composure and stand on her own hooves, Soarin backed off and landed near her, eyeing her figure all the while. He was always a pony to break the ice after an embarrassing situation, and blatantly asked the teacher with a nervous chuckle, "So, how'd I do, Teach?" cheerilee giggled as she packed the last of her things away and answered teasily, "A for effort, Soarin. although your performance needs a little work. Soarin flew to the doorway and watched as cheerilee followed him over on her, rather slow, considering his speed, path along the floor. She could just be walking funny due to the recent activities, however. With a smirk, Soarin followed up and questioned her. Maybe we could schedule another parent-teacher conference, say next week? Oh, I'm sure I could squeeze you in.